This is the Moonlight Graham Show, a freewheeling conversation with the role players, the underdogs, and guys with flat-out great stories in sports.
Hello and welcome back to the Moonlight Graham Show, and welcome to Season 10 of the podcast. It is great to be back as we wrap up 2020. And folks, ladies and gentlemen, I think this season, Season 10 of the podcast, is primed to be our best yet. We are kicking off Season 10 with a Moonlighter who spent over 45 years coaching football. His name is Steve Loney. Now, Steve Loney, that name may ring a bell to a lot of you if you follow the game of college football or professional football, because he essentially has been in college or professional football since 1970. He grew up in Marshalltown, Iowa. After going to Marshalltown High School, Steve Loney went on to play for Earl Bruce and Johnny Majors at Iowa State University from 1970 to 1973 on some actually really good Iowa State football teams. That was actually a successful time of Iowa State football. And at that time, Steve fell in love with the Cyclones. And right after college, he started his coaching career as a graduate assistant at Iowa State before moving on to places like Missouri Western, Morehead State, the Citadel, Colorado State, the Phoenix Cardinals in the NFL, UConn, where he worked under Skip Holtz before leading his way back to Iowa State under Dan McCarney, when McCarney and his staff there helped revitalize the program in the mid-90s. So he was at Iowa State from 95 to 97 before going up to the Minnesota Vikings and becoming the offensive coordinator and offensive line coach for the Vikings for a few years. And then he came back to Iowa State once again in some successful years in 2000 and 2001 before spending essentially the better part of the last 2 decades once again in the NFL. And Steve Loney, he's one of these guys where he's connected to almost everyone in football. And why I wanted to have him on the podcast, over the years, we've had a lot of ex-Cyclone football players on the podcast. Guys like Seneca Wallace and Sage Rosenfels and Tim Cohn. We have Joe Woodley coming up on the podcast later this season. We've had Nick Mosier, Todd Blythe, all these guys. And the name that consistently keeps coming up outside of, like, say, Dan McCarney is Steve Loney. For whatever reason, a lot of these ex-players, they speak so highly of Steve Loney that it was really resonating with me, that thinking he's a guy that must have really cared about his players. He made an impression on his players. I'd love to get him on the podcast just to hear his stories. And that's what we did here. So Steve Loney, he's got family up in Gilbert. And a couple of weeks ago, I actually drove up to Gilbert. He and I were in a garage together, and it felt like one of these recruiting visits. It felt like I was sitting down with a football coach, for a recruiting visit. And I did not cut this interview short because he could go all day with his football stories. And it's so fun to listen to a guy like Steve Loney talk football, talk Cyclones, and just tell stories. And so we went about an hour and a half with this interview, but I didn't want to cut this one short because Steve Loney, he's a special guy. He's a great football coach, and especially with the season that Iowa State is having right now as we enter their bowl game in the Fiesta Bowl, I wanted to kind of try to tell the story of Iowa State football over the last 50 years. The highs in the 1970s with Johnny Majors and Earl Bruce, the lows in like the 80s and early 90s under Jim Walden and Kreiner, before Dan McCarney, Steve Loney, Mike Woodley, and that staff helped bring back Cyclone football with Troy Davis into the 2000s and Sage Rosenfels and Seneca Wallace and some really good teams there, and help build to what it is today under Matt Campbell. And so this was a really fun episode. I'm really glad that we're doing it here as the Cyclones enter the Fiesta Bowl, maybe the biggest bowl in Cyclone football history. And so I think you guys are really going to like this one, especially if you like football. If you're an Iowa State fan, this one is for you. And folks, if you've been following the podcast on social media as of lately, you probably noticed that we just released something called the Moonlight Chronicles. The Moonlight Chronicles, they're up on our website. If you're interested, go check them out at moonlightgrahamshow.com on the Chronicles tab. What the Chronicles are, they're like a deep dive into sporting events, sporting games, great games of the past, like the Drake versus Western Kentucky game in the NCAA tournament, the UNI versus Kansas game in the NCAA tournament, tournament. In a lot of games from my childhood that really formed who I am as a sports fan. And if you're interested in that type of stuff, head over to our website, check out the Moonlight Chronicles. So far, we've got a ton of great feedback on it. We're going to keep doing more Chronicles during season 10. They'll be up on our website as well. So over time, periodically check out the Chronicles, follow us on social media. But folks, thank you for sticking with us through our first 9 seasons. I hope you guys will enjoy the 10th season of the podcast. It's going to be our best yet. And enjoy today's episode with Moonlighter Steve Loney. Steve, thanks for joining us on the Moonlight Graham Show.
Well, it's an honor to be here.
So you grew up, did you grow up outside of Marshalltown?
No, we were right in Marshalltown.
You were in Marshalltown.
We were in Marshalltown. Now, when I came to Iowa State in 1970, my folks moved to a farm just south of Marshalltown.
Okay, because I'm looking up at a sign there. There's like an Oak Hill. How do you pronounce that?
Charlay's
Ranch.
That's the white cows you see.
Oh, okay. You can tell.
That's a Charlay.
So did you guys have Charlay cows?
My dad, he did. He didn't grow up a farmer, but when he moved out there, he had several acres, and he thought that white cows on a rolling hill would be beautiful, and so that's what he did. And he had maybe 70 head.
What do you do with Charlays? You breed them and then sell the calves?
And then and they're. I think mostly Dad sold them at auction sales,
right.
And I think probably just for meat, But,
sure. So what was growing up in Marshalltown, in the 50s and 60s like?
Well, it was very good for me. Loved Marshalltown. I was able to be affected by some great coaches. George Funk, that's in the Iowa High School Hall of Fame, was very influential. We had George Hawes was one of my coaches as an assistant coach, and then came on and was the track coach, even though I wasn't involved in track, and had some great battles with Ames High School and track. So I was exposed to a lot of good coaches there and tough coaches. Mm-hmm. Coach Donahue, who was the line coach, I'll never forget, we went out one day and we were underneath what they call the chutes, where the topped off. It keeps you down low.
Yep.
And Doug Noyd was watering, kind of softening the ground. Coach Donahue ripped into him and said, that dirt had almost cut your arm when you fell on it, but he didn't want that, and so it was tough. In fact, then you were soft if you needed to drink water during
right.
practice. I mean, things like that, and we had my sophomore year. Marshalltown was rated number 1 in the state preseason. We went down to Oskaloosa on the opening game and got beat.
Ooh.
So Jack Blazek was the head coach then, and he came and worked for Johnny Majors after he left Marshalltown, and then he's from the Red Oak area, and he's a legendary coach down that area, and did an excellent job. But he was hard nosed, and so showed up for practice on Monday, and there was a sign on the door and said, no practice today, but tell your mothers you won't be home for dinner tomorrow.
Uh-oh.
And, of course, the fear of God came through everybody in that team. And sure enough, and at that time, 6th period was all athletes. And so in the off season, they could have us in the weight room, but they could start practice before 2 o'clock. Mm-hmm. So we started somewhere around 2. And when we ran sprints at the end, it was so dark that at the end of our practice field was a small little hill. and I can't remember now which one of my teammates, but we were running till some guys dropped, but he ran down to the one end, and he went down over that hill and waited for us to come back. It was so dark that the coaches couldn't, they couldn't see.
Yeah, he hid under the
Oh, yeah. And so he just waited and caught his breath and waited for us on the return trip.
That's pretty good.
Yeah. So it was, and some of those things, now, just aren't sound physically, but
different time.
Yeah, it was a different time, and
well, Steve, you mentioned the weight room there.
Yeah.
So 6th period, some of the athletes, you get in the weight room maybe before practice, late in the school day. But, we're talking about the 1960s when you're in high school. So how prevalent was weightlifting in the 60s?
It really wasn't that much. It more was about agilities, movement. And, in fact, in our weight room, we had a universal gym. And I don't know.
Was that like one of those machines?
Yeah, well, it's kind of in a circle, and it's got the
like the pulley systems and things.
Yeah, the pulley system.
Yeah,
and
I think
it
I know
has
what you're
one
talking.
that you're doing the pull downs, but it was self-contained.
Yeah,
and so it was very. And so you'd get on, and so weightlifting wasn't much. I can tell you how different it was I came to Iowa State, and in our off season, weightlifting really wasn't required. Now the agilities, and we did combatives with Jackie Sherrill that were rather brutal, but the weightlifting was kind of wasn't a big deal. And I can remember we were in state gym, and there were different rooms where they had the weights. It wasn't a self-contained room. Mm-hmm. And somebody came running down the hall and said, Henry Lewis is going to try 300 pounds on the bench. And everybody goes running down there, and sure enough, he gets up, and I thought, holy cow, 300 pounds. Now running backs are bench pressing.
Oh, yeah, high school kids are doing 300 pounds.
And 300 pounds. And Henry Lewis, somebody sent a game program, the Oklahoma State game program, I think from 1971, sent it to me. And Henry's only about 280 pounds, mm-hmm. and heaven's sakes, Jimmy Kleinsasser that we had with the Vikings, he was not quite 280, but he would have been a big offensive lineman in our system. So the times really have changed.
How big were you? How big were you?
I was not big. I ended up walking on at Iowa State. I was going to play for Herb Taylor at Marshtown Community College, and it just didn't feel right for me. And so I went to Iowa State, ended up walking on. I've talked to kids, walking on isn't easy to do. Right. My freshman year, there were 16 of us. And I was the only one that was still playing my senior year.
Wow!
And so, it's not an easy way to go. So I was not, one of those guys you look at and say, "Oh gosh, what a great."
You weren't Henry Lewis.
No, I wasn't Henry Lewis. Sherman Miller, any of these guys that had great careers, but I certainly. And it was great to be a part of those days at Iowa State.
Yeah, I was looking at that, and I think there's a little bit of a misconception about Iowa State football in the 70s because of kind of how bad Iowa State football was in the 80s and the early 90s before McCarney got there. But with Johnny Majors, and there were some really good coaches that came through Iowa State in the 70s when – you were there at a really interesting time with Johnny Majors there from 70 to 73, and there were some bowl games in the 70s. Iowa State was nationally ranked. It got bad in the 80s, but Iowa State was a pretty good football program in the 1970s.
Yeah, we were. We finished 8-3 in
72 or 73. Right?
I think it was 70. No, it was 71.
Was it?
And we finished 8-3. And the 3 teams that beat us finished number 1, number 2, and number 3 in the country.
Wow.
And then we went to a bowl game and played. So the Big 8 at that time, I mean, it was legendary. There was no question. You know, you had the Southwestern Conference and some of those, but there was no question in the 70s who the best conference was in the country.
What was it like to play for Johnny Majors?
Coach Majors was very good to me. He and Earl Bruce, I played...
Earl Bruce, that was the other name I was trying to think of.
I played for Earl my senior year, and so I was with Coach Majors my freshman, sophomore, and junior years. And those two couldn't be any more different. Johnny was the consummate salesman, and he's the one that really, you know, helped get things started there at Iowa State. When Jerry Moses committed to come to Iowa State, and he and I were in the same class, I can remember reading the paper, and I said, man, Jerry Moses is going to Iowa State? I said, you know, because everybody was after Jerry at USC, you know, he could have gone any place. And Coach Majors brought Jerry, and you know, and so the salesmanship, you know, we got good players. There was a great coaching staff. I mean, Jackie Sherrill.
Yep.
Jimmy Johnson was on that staff.
Yeah, was he there when you were there?
No, he had been there the year before. So my senior year in high school, he was there. Mm-hmm. And then as I was coming there, it was the summer before, he went to Oklahoma State from Iowa State. So he had Jimmy Johnson.
Pete Carroll came by through Iowa State.
Yeah, you know, Pete Carroll was there. Now, he was an Earl Bruce coach, but there have been some great coaches that have been at Iowa State.
What was appealing to those type of great coaches about Iowa State at that time? Was it playing in the Big 8 because the Big 8 was such a prominent league at that time?
Well, I think so, and also Coach Majors' staff was very young and very energetic, and you know, they were all coaches getting their start at that level. And so I think that was the appeal, and that's why Johnny could put such a good staff together, is that he was young at the time, but the people he attracted and brought along with him were young as well. And for them to be able to coach, and so he had those coaches, and you know, so the energy level, and of course we got good pretty quick.
So you mentioned Clyde Williams Field earlier. Like, most Cyclone fans can't even remember a time before Jack Trice Stadium. I know I can't. Like, my entire life, Jack Trice Stadium, that's where I've been going to games. What was Clyde Williams Field like, and playing games there on campus?
It was exciting when the students on game day, and I can't remember now when they opened, but let's say they opened the gates at 10. Uh-huh. There was a line, Friley Hall sits right there. There was a line that would go all the way and would wrap around, and, you know, that was a party in itself, was the line to get in the stadium. And we had in the one end, in the closed end zone, on the one end zone was state gym. The other end zone was closed, but it wasn't all the way down to the ground. It was a little bit off the ground. And there was a time in one of the great moments and then disappointing moments was we played Nebraska. We go down, and George Amundsen, Dean Carlson, those guys, we go down. We tie the game up with basically no time left on the clock. And Tom Gedgen was our kicker. He was in my class. And students are jumping out of that end zone closed-in area. They were jumping out onto the field. Well, Tom had walked off his steps for the extra point, and they're, you know, and it takes a while to clear the students from the field, and never did get back in his routine, and he missed the extra point.
Oh, you know what that reminds me of? That reminds me of when Iowa State was going to win the Big 12 North with McCarney in like 2005 maybe or 6 against Missouri, and they had that chip shot field goal. My brother and I were running onto the field. We were running onto the field as he missed, similar as I think it was Brent Culbertson missed that field goal, similar to the having to clear the students against Nebraska in that game that you're talking about.
Well, you bet. And I look and I was so proud of Mac and what he did in that, with the Iowa State program, because a great weekend coming up.
Oh, man.
This weekend, and it'll be big for Iowa State. But, like you said, we were one kick away from that championship game that year.
Yeah.
I mean, and
it was right there. It was like a 27-yard field goal.
Yeah. I mean, he's right there. And so, it's not like we haven't been to that point. And to Matt's credit and what the staff has done, they've gotten into that game, but those 2 kicks were well, and also we're playing Alabama in the Independence Bowl.
Oh, Tony Yelk.
Yeah, and there are some people that say
it went over the upright.
Yeah,
which is technically good.
It is good, and so as an Iowa Stater, I think they went with the big name of Alabama and said no good, but
right. Going into this weekend's game, you got to think that, like, Cyclone fans, if you've been following Iowa State football for long enough, you don't want it to come down to the kicker. Just so you know, whatever happens, just like if
let's
there's
win by 2 touchdowns.
It's going to be a dark, a couple of minutes, make or miss leading up to that for all the fans. If it's going to have to come down to a kick, that commercial break leading into it's going to be hard.
Yeah, that's right.
So you played at Iowa State. You were a grad assistant at Iowa State right afterwards before you start your coaching career out of Iowa State. But then you had the chance to come back under Coach Mack in the 90s. What was that like to come back home, after, what was it, about 20 years, to come back home to Iowa State under McCarney and try to resurrect the Iowa State football program to get it back to where it was with Earl Bruce and Johnny Majors?
Yeah. I think when you go into coaching, and in 1974, Joe Bugle was on that staff. Randy Hart, Tom Backus. There are a lot of excellent coaches for Earl, and I had my goal in my career was to become the head coach at Iowa State, and everything that I did, every decision I made from then until I got too old to be considered. Everything I did was based on that goal. And so in coming back in 1995, there was no greater thrill. I was at University of Connecticut with Skip Holtz, and Skip called, and he said, I got a phone call from some guy by the name of Dan McCarney, and he wants to interview you for his staff at Iowa State. And he said to me on the phone, I mean, the disrespect he showed Iowa State, he said, I'm sure you don't want to go, but you might want to call and just have a conversation with him. Mm-hmm. In the back of my mind, I'm saying, hey, Skip, if I get offered, I'm gone. So sure enough, I did, and I came out and interviewed, and at that time, it was for the offensive line job. Dan did not really have an offensive coordinator in mind, and it ended up, my offensive line interview ended up for the coordinator's job. But it was such a thrill for me, and one of the real high points of my career.
How hard is it to kind of build a program? Because that's what, I mean, after the Walden era at Iowa State football was in a bad place. The facilities were bad. they had the turf, the AstroTurf on Jack Trice. You know, it was just in a bad place, and it really needed a guy like Dan McCarney who can recruit, who's got energy. He brought life into the program. You know, they had Troy Davis right after that, which was a big kind of attention thing for Iowa State at that time. But I got to imagine you guys knew that you were taking on a lot as a coaching staff to try to get the program back with the Big 8 and the Big 12.
Well, here's what I think. First of all, you got to hire Dan McCarney. I have such a love for that guy and what he did for this school and the type of person he was. You know, we had some dark days in those first 3 years.
Right.
And Dan was always this way. Sunday morning after a loss, and we had way too many, but after a loss, you know, he was barely talking. He was, you know, sadly watching film. And we always had a family meal on Sunday nights. Well, like clockwork, when we would have that family meal, after that meal, you could see it was almost like he got a shot of adrenaline. And by Wednesday, he had you absolutely convinced that we were going to beat Texas, we were going to beat Oklahoma, right, whoever it was. We're convinced we were going to be the upset of the year. So Dan McCarney is that's one way of turning the program around. Along with that, to me, I think it's important to have people that Iowa State means something to.
Right.
When I was on Earl's staff and we were out at Colorado State, we sat around and we were waiting for Earl. He was doing an interview or something, and somebody said, "Well, if you could be the head coach any place in the United States, where would you go?" And Urban Meyer was on that staff, and I won't reveal what he picked, but it wasn't Ohio State University. I will tell you that. So I've reminded him of that several times.
Yeah, because Urban Meyer, that might still come true for Urban Meyer.
Yeah, he still might have a shot of the. Yeah. And if it is, I'll tell you the school that he mentioned. And we had Mike Turgvac, longtime D-line coach for the Packers, and a great player at Michigan. And so we go around the table, and it gets to me, and I say as quickly as Iowa State University.
Wow.
And they look and they say, "What? No, you don't understand the question. You can have any job you want. What job is it going to be?" I said, "Iowa State University."
Wow.
You know, and that's how I felt about it. And for me, I always bird up on assistant coaches, and you could tell the ones that were there just to
fill a resume
and move on to the next place.
Yep.
You know, and so, you know, that being said, I think you have to have people that have a love for Iowa State or the uniqueness of this school.
You're right about that, and I think that's what's kind of been – I mean, because Iowa State has such a great fan base, right? And because so many of the fans went to school at Iowa State, they care so much about our state, and you've seen that with the great coaches through the years, not just in football, but guys like Johnny Orr, who did so well and so beloved here. And then on the football side, you had Dan McCarney, and you had Matt Campbell right now, and even Paul Rhodes. I think that's why it was so hard to move away from Paul Rhodes, because you could tell Paul Rhodes was a guy that loved Iowa State, but, you know, it is a business. And I think to that respect, and I won't ask for you to comment on this, but that's why Gene Chizik just didn't work. Like, Gene Chizik didn't seem like a guy that was in it for the long haul at Iowa State. But, you know, Matt Campbell, I think the fan base believes in him, and he said, I have no reason to believe Matt Campbell will ever leave based on what he said.
Well, I would tell you this. You're absolutely right about Gene Chizik. I don't mind commenting on that. In fact, there was a time where I got in trouble because I did comment on that. The first time he was in Ames, Iowa, on Iowa State's campus, was at the press conference announcing him. Mm-hmm. And I had a friend on the staff that said about 30 days out that Gene Chizik said, I might have made a mistake taking this job.
Wow.
And I'm thinking, and personally, I resented that.
Right, because it's a job that you respected so much.
Yeah, and for some guy just take this job so he can get the next big head coaching job. I had a conversation, and I was standing. In fact, it was at here in Gilbert. Fred Hoiberg lived in Gilbert, and his kids were friends with my grandkids. And at the time, I knew that Fred would have opportunities, and we were just talking. And at that time, it had nothing to do with any job offer he had. But I said, you know what, Fred? You could probably go 0-32 for 3 years straight before one person in this community would ever suggest that you weren't the guy for this job. And I said, what a wonderful position to be in. And Fred, in his way, understood that, and he, I think, appreciated it. But I look at now, somebody said, well, Matt Campbell, I hope they can keep him another year, and I say to them, why? I mean, why do you say that?
Right.
I mean, nobody says anything about Ferentz staying for 99 years at the University of Iowa. Right? I mean, why? These facilities, and especially, I don't know what the new facility that's being built, but it's going to be nice.
It's going to be incredible.
These facilities are as nice. It may not have the cherry wood that they have at the University of Texas, but it's going to be every bit as practical and able for you to do your job. He's paid a lot of money, and at some point in time, for every person, when is enough money enough?
Right.
If
you're living in Gilbert, Iowa, making $5 million a year, you're going to be just fine.
Yeah. You don't have to worry about lunch the next day. So he's given the tools. He has the support. And so when people say that, I'm incredulous about it. When I hear him say it, I say, why do you say that?
Right.
I fully expect Matt Campbell to be here.
Oh, I think so too. And it's funny just because it speaks to a larger perception about the Iowa State program, right? Because I think the national media, Hawkeye fans in the state, Husker fans, they want Iowa State to be a stopping point for great coaches. And you can tell that the Hawkeye fans are a little threatened by Campbell, and they're the ones constantly bringing those rumors up, and in the national media as well, because they don't really see what's happening here on a day-to-day basis. But so far, everything that Campbell has said, everything that he's done, leads us to believe he's not going anywhere. It's just all the speculation by people that don't really get it.
And when you look at their season, and I didn't study it as a coach or anything, but as a fan, I'm looking at their season, and they got beat by a good team, but that they shouldn't get beat by in the opener, right? And we had four turnovers against Oklahoma State and get beat by 3.
Right.
So it really, it's very realistic to say that they could have been in the college football playoff conversation.
And still could make it.
Yeah, I don't think there's any way. There was an article today in Sports Illustrated that blasted Gary Barta and Iowa State, and as it has to do with the Bearcats at Cincinnati and Coastal Carolina and some people. So there's always going to be those naysayers on things like that. But had we been going into this game undefeated, I think it's very realistic to say with a win, you're one of the top 4 teams
if they were undefeated right now, they'd be ahead of Ohio State, no question.
Right.
They might be behind Alabama, Notre Dame, and still Clemson with one loss, but they'd be ahead of Ohio State for sure.
Right. And I say that only because when so they say, well, he'll leave because of facilities. Well, they can't say that anymore.
Right.
They say that he'll leave because of money. Well, you really can't say that. He could make $10 million a year someplace, but you've addressed that issue. So money is an issue. And so now they fall and say, well, you can't win the national championship at Iowa State. Well, I think that's malarkey.
Mm-hmm.
Because you look at the situation they're in, and I don't think it's any conspiracy theory to say that, they very well could have been in the top 4. And once you get into that scenario, anything can happen. So, you can win a national championship here.
So, Steve, I want to get back to your coaching career specifically here. You spent a lot of time as an offensive line coach, and you also spent a lot of time as an offensive coordinator, sometimes doing both roles at once. What type of offense did you like to run?
Well, in fact, I was always the only time I wasn't the coordinator is when in pro football, where I was just the offensive line. So
even at Minnesota, you were both offensive coordinator
both,
and O-line.
And when I was a coordinator for the Vikings, I did both jobs, which was really tough at that level. But that role I really liked because Earl Bruce taught me a long time ago when you started talking about protections that you better talk about keeping the quarterback clean and letting him throw the ball down the field. When you work for a coordinator that's only known quarterback play or wide receiver play, a lot of times those guys want to get out as many receivers as they can.
And they're not protecting the quarterback. So I think you've got to start from that. You've got to protect the guy. The shotgun was not a big part, even though we did quite a bit of it in 2000, 2001. It was a part of our offense, but it wasn't it totally. I was amazed in my years at pro football when I'd go around and I'd work some of these guys out. There were offensive linemen that had never, ever put their hand on the ground. Unbelievable.
And so there were some real changes there. And I always, I would joke with Coach Campbell about this, is 4th and half a yard. And so you're going to snap the ball 5 yards back. And so, Lord knows there are a lot of people being successful doing that.
Right.
But that's not in my DNA.
You bring that up because it always drives me insane because you see, actually, Iowa does a really good job of this. The quarterback sneak at Iowa, right? They get like 3 yards a quarterback sneak. Tom Brady's really good at it. There's some other good quarterbacks that's like 4th and a half a yard under center. It's unstoppable. They're going to get it. But you mentioned it. You see a lot of quarterbacks nowadays, they get to the combine, they get to the NFL draft, and they've never taken a snap under center before.
Right.
And it's almost like they're deficient in this, and that the offensive coordinators almost in the NFL today have to adapt to quarterbacks not being able to take a snap under center. Did you run into that in the NFL?
Yeah. I mean, like I say, in my time was with offensive linemen,
right?
But I would literally work out some guys who had never put their hand on the ground, and so they have to learn that. And so, and I'm not. Lord knows anybody that watched our offense, there were plenty of times I got cussed and thought I was the dumbest guy known to man.
For being too boring?
Yeah, but you got to run the ball, you got to protect the passer, and you can't turn the ball over. Those were 3 staples. But that's changed. It's all evolving. and it'll go back someday. But when you do look at you look at Mahomes, and he does a lot out of the shotgun, but he'll go up under center too, right. And Brady and those guys, and they do both. And I think in when you looked at our offenses here at Iowa State, especially 2000, 2001. We were both. In 95, 96, 97, we were going to hit you in the mouth. And
well, you hand it to Troy Davis and run behind Tim Cohn.
Yeah. Well, and that's one of those things. You look at that offensive line, and you had Tim. You had Matt Rayfelt from Ames here. You had Patrick Anafa.
Yeah.
And Paul Scartweet started that season before Pat got in good enough shape to play. And then you had Doug Easley, and you had Byron Heights. And Doug was a walk-on. Paul was a senior that had not played, I don't think, a great deal prior to that. Byron Heights was a first-time starter. And so, but those guys were, they bought into the program, and they were hard-nosed, do things the right way. And
well, they must have been doing something right, because you got Troy Davis at that time. And he's the only running back in NCAA history to run over 2,000 yards twice. And everybody knew who was getting the ball. How did you game plan when the defense knows where the ball is going? How did you guys still get that guy the yards and march down the field every possession when you knew the defense knew what you were going to do?
Well, you had to throw the ball enough to keep people honest. If you had 7 blockers, you had to get those 7 blocked, and so when they tried to get an 8th guy in, then that's when Troy did his magic of making that guy miss.
Right.
But we had some frustrating days. Kansas State, when they had Terrence Newman at
great defensive back.
Yeah, great defensive back. They literally locked down our wide receivers, and their safeties were like linebackers. And if I remember correctly, Troy still got 100 yards, but we couldn't throw the ball a lick. So it wasn't just Troy. There was enough of a passing game in there that they couldn't, they couldn't just go one-on-one with the guys that we had. And we did enough in that regard that their safeties could not be linebackers. And when they filled in late, then Troy did a great job and a great running back. I do think, though, not to correct you, but you need to check. I do think this guy from Wisconsin a year ago did it.
Yeah.
I think he did the 2000, but for a long time.
Was that Jonathan Taylor?
I don't know what the guy's name was.
They've had a bunch of good backs at Wisconsin.
Yeah, but
I'll check
there
my
were
stats.
There were a lot of years of college football that no one, Eddie George, Barry Sanders, any of those guys did what Troy Davis did.
Well, it was less games back then too. He was doing it at like a 10-game regular season schedule. So speaking of that. We're seeing a lot. Iowa State's got a great running back right now, Breece Hall.
He is.
He's phenomenal. He's going to be playing on Sundays.
Yep.
And I see a lot of this stuff on social media that's saying already they're saying that Breece Hall's better than Troy Davis. As a football guy yourself, coach Troy Davis, seen them both play. Where do you rank Breece Hall in relation to Troy?
I'm not sure I've seen Breece Hall rush for 2,000 yards yet, so I'm going to stick with Troy Davis. Now, I say that being biased, and I don't say that in any way being disrespectful of Breece Hall, because maybe if you went out in a foot race, Brees Hall might be faster than Troy. Troy was not, when you got him in the open, he wasn't a burner. Mm-hmm. Brees Hall may be faster than him. Now, if you ask Matt Campbell a question, he'd probably put Brees above Troy. But until he's rushed for 2,000 yards, I'll stick with Troy.
So a lot of guys we've had on this show have brought your name up. Seneca Wallace, Joe Woodley, Tim Cohn. Why is it that they, out of all the coaches that they've had, why does your name keep coming up with those guys?
Well, I'm honored. I also, excuse me, to me, relationships were important. Now, I was tough on them, but they know I loved them.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's the cool thing about sports, right, is unlike, the working world, it's a time where you see the highest of highs, the lowest of lows. You see guys naked in the shower. You see, road trips. You spend meals together. You spend so much time together, and you really get to know guys at a different level, especially like with college athletics. You're seeing these guys grow up. You're seeing them go from like 17, 18-year-old kids to young men at 22, 23 years old. And so it's a really transformative time. And to that point, like I had a kid last week, right? And two of the first guys that texted me were my college coaches. And those are guys that I love and care about so much. And it made me feel so good to hear from them years later, because it also shows that like these relationships stand the test of time. You might have coworkers or friends that you haven't heard from for 10 years, players that you've coached, but you've been through so much with them that those bonds never break, and you can pick right up where you left off with some of these guys, even if you haven't seen or talked to them for a long time.
Yeah, they, and I do stay in touch with a lot of them. That's a nice thing. I had to get off social media. Sage made me get off social media because he drove me absolutely nuts, and I wanted to be in an argument with him about once a day. So I got off social media because of Sage, and I told him that. So he just laughs. But it's a nice thing about texting, because you may not have a lot of time, but you can, Patrick Anafa, I sent him a text last week. Something came to me, and I just passed it on to him and said, "You were a part of this," and so texting, it really helps you do that. But and I think too that players know sincerity. When I made a mistake, I had no trouble owning up to that, holding myself and them accountable for representing Iowa State, and the type of people they were, and also what they did on the football field. And so that being said, I think once a kid knows that you love him, then you can coach him hard. If all you do is coach him hard, then they're saying, well, is this guy trying to just make a name for himself so he can just move, and so I think that's what it was based upon. And there was only one set offensive lineman. There was one year at the Rams that I just didn't have that bond and never could get it, and that was a bad year.
Yeah, you've been in a lot of locker rooms. From Moorhead State and Drake and Leavenworth High School and the Cardinals and the Rams and the Cowboys, and you've been in a lot of locker rooms. What is the biggest difference you think between a college football locker room and an NFL locker room?
I think social media, and see, I have not been in a college locker room since social media has become so big. But I would say that that's a big negative. I would see, and not so much with offensive linemen. I look at, Mike Rosenthal and Dave Dixon and Matt Burke, Corbin Lucina, Brian McKinney, those guys, Adam Goldberg that I had with the Vikings. They, in a lot of ways, they were like coaching college kids. Now, I did not get upset as much with those guys, and I could be more of a co-worker than I was having to put the hammer on them in pro football. But they're very, very similar. But I saw like wide receivers maybe didn't get a lot of touches in a game. Well, they get hammered in so many different directions on social media. Fantasy football,
yeah.
And so they feel pressure due to what's happening in social media, and so that can change their outlook on things. And so that to me was the biggest difference in the locker rooms.
Yeah. And you bring that up, and, one of your last years in the league, you were with the Cowboys, and not just social media, but you guys had like a documentary crew with that All or Nothing program, which actually I watched. I thought it was great. You were part of Jason Garrett's staff there.
Yep.
And I thought the glimpse behind the scenes of that entire season and how professional the Cowboys seemed. I was really impressed with Garrett and the whole staff, and because that was a tough year for the Cowboys. What was that like, from your time at Iowa State or in college, there's a lot that goes on behind closed doors. Then you go for the Cowboys, maybe one of the top 5 most famous sports franchises in the world. Jerry Jones is the owner. You got a documentary film crew following you guys for the whole season. What was that experience like, especially from growing up in Marshalltown, Iowa?
Well, first of all, Mr. Jones, I think, is the best owner in football. He gets a bad rap because he is involved. I mean, we'd have a personnel meeting, and you had to give your evaluations to him as well as the head coach, and he would ask questions. I mean, he was a college football and All-American at Arkansas.
Yeah.
And so it wasn't like, I was with some owners that didn't know if a football was blown up or stuffed up, and it was just a way for them to make money. That isn't true with Mr. Jones, and he's a tremendous businessman, and so he was not over involved. He was involved, but it wasn't like you were talking to some classroom idiot about football.
Right.
I mean, he understood it. So that was the first thing. That documentary thing, I wasn't totally comfortable with, and it also shows you the pull that Jason Witten had because they were installing those cameras in everybody's meeting room. So this is during the summer, so I'm talking to Witt, and I said, hey, Witt, you can handle it a couple different ways. I said, either you can say something, or our first meeting, I'm going to take wire cutters, and I'm going to cut the wires to that camera. I said, because we are not going to have a camera in our meeting room. And so we went through the entire season, and
not a whole lot of O-line meetings.
There was never a camera in our meeting room, And I always And they, as an assistant, they'd slap the microphone on you. They took each assistant and did it one time, and the one time, it made me feel uncomfortable. So, those things are, I know they're great drama for people to view, to get an inside look, but I tried to just be myself, and but you could see there were some coaches that played to the camera. And
Derek Dooley.
Boy.
He liked having the camera in that wide receiver room for him.
Yeah. So
it's funny. You spent a lot of time in football, and you've kind of seen it and done it all. But I got to imagine there's something different about coaching for the Cowboys, and being a part of America's team and stuff. Even though, like, at that point you're 40 years into your career, but did you ever just pinch yourself walking into Jerry World, the stadium down there, walking into some of those meeting rooms? That was the first thing that struck me when I was watching that documentary. Is like, whoa, everything is first class here. This is
everything.
Like the Yankees of, you know what I mean? Like,
yeah,
it was pretty remarkable.
Yeah, I think that pro football teams will base, and you see it now with the Vikings and so on, that they've taken a lot of what Mr. Jones did to incorporate into theirs. There is nothing second class about Jerry Jones and what he does. But there are expectations that go with that, as well. So there certainly were moments that, and I was sitting talking to my wife. I watch TV, and I'm overwhelmed by the fact, I see Tony Romo, on CBS, and I'm thinking, well, he and I sat beside each other. I see Emmitt Smith, being interviewed, and Emmitt Smith and I had lunch together, and that's not me dropping names, but, I sat and had lunch with Paul Tagliabue when he was commissioner, when we were with the Vikings, when he had lunch with our staff. And so I look and, God has blessed me far more than I deserve. But, I look and I say, up until this the new stadiums this year, I had coached in all 32 stadiums, which was, was kind of neat. We were up in Giants Stadium one time, and my son came out, and of course Phil Simms was from Morehead State, and I knew him from when I coached there because he'd come back and do a camp every year. So here's Phil Simms, Lawrence Taylor talking, and I'm sitting there. The three of us are talking, and my son walks up, and and I'm thinking, there's a lot of kids that don't get that opportunity.
Right.
So I've been blessed unbelievably in the experience I've had, and you can only dream about, and not necessarily be anything I've done. I've just been in the right place and been in great organizations like the Cowboys.
So part of being a great professional athlete, it's not just about talent, right? A lot of the guys that not only make it into the NFL or the major leagues or the NBA, it's about having the talent to get there, but also being a pro to stay there, learning your role, how to be a professional, how to take care of yourself, how to take care of your family. All of that stuff means a lot. The guys that have the talent, but they don't get that part of how to be a pro, they don't last very long. Who was the guy that you thought, man, that is the quintessential professional athlete right there?
Matt Burke, Jason Witten, and I can, those two would be at the top of the list, and I'm sure somebody would be offended that I didn't put them there. But those two certainly would be at the top of that list. And a name that a lot of Iowa Staters will know is I also was responsible for drafting Rico Gathers.
Oh, yeah.
And he's at the opposite end of that continuum. And I was extremely disappointed that didn't work out, because there's a guy, I'm just telling you, I watched him. He did things that Jason Witten couldn't do physically.
Yeah, and for fans, if they don't recognize the Rico Gathers, Rico Gathers was a basketball player down at Baylor. Yep. And at the Cowboys, you guys drafted him. I don't think he had ever played college football before.
He didn't even play high school football.
He didn't even play high school football.
No.
Yeah, and then he was in the NFL. What was he, 6'8", 6'9", probably about 280 pounds or so?
Yeah, 280, 290. Had just great hands. He had to learn how to block. I mean, that part, but
that's
in pro football, yeah. But in pro football, they're you can still utilize a guy that can get down the field. In the Hall of Fame game against the Cardinals, he has a catch in the end zone that's just, eye-opening.
Yeah.
So there is talent there. But he would do things in the off season and not be around. And I'd sit down with him. I'd say, Rico, listen, in our meeting room, you're sitting next to the greatest example that you could look at as a tight end. And I said, I know you don't have a lot of experience in football, but if you're not sure what to do and I'm not around, just do what Witt does.
Yeah, copy Witten.
Just copy him.
Yeah.
And so, and I got along with Rico. It's not, I don't have hard feelings, but, to your question, there are those situations that, there's some great talent that never gets realized.
Oh,
You've got to be self-aware. There's things you do well. There's things you need to work on. And when you look at the Jason Wittens, the Matt Burks of the world, Witten made me a better coach. I absolutely would not go into a meeting flying by the seat of my pants, because
he made sure you were prepared.
Yeah, he would know.
Yeah.
And he would lose respect for me if that ever was the case. And so he, from that standpoint, he made me a better coach. And
that's why he's still in the league. I mean, the guy's like 39 years old, and he's playing for Oakland right now.
Yeah, he just it's
Las
either
Vegas.
14 or 15. I lose track with the Monday Night Football hiatus, but he's just unbelievable. But so therefore, that was me as a coach, and so the other people around him would feel the same way.
Right. Yeah, it's part of the culture, right? When you have some really good leaders and player-led teams, it builds a culture of excellence, and that's what it takes to be great. Now, we've actually had Matt Burke on the podcast. I'm not sure if you knew that or not, but Matt Burke said, which it was kind of surprising, and I know faith is really important to Matt Burke.
Yep.
And he talked about the football locker room being a very faithful place, which kind of surprised me a little bit. I was not expecting that response or that answer when we had him on. And he talked about, just because guys are so They know they're kind of going to battle, and they know that there's a lot at stake, both physically and through their families and all this stuff, that it really bonds guys together through belief in a higher power and through prayer together and bonds men together. Did you see that same thing that Burke sees with the Christian faith or other faiths being strong in the locker rooms?
Yeah, it was, and there were, both ends of the continuum in the thing, but there's certainly, as there is in society, there's a strong contingent of people of faith, and it's just a microcosm of what you see in society, and so there are people that do that. That increasingly got more important for me in my coaching career. You talk about that show. One thing I cringe on when I watch Hard Knocks or I watch that is the language.
Oh, it's pretty bad.
It's bad, and I got to be where. In fact, it was something that happened in the Ohio University game in 1995. Iowa State hadn't won a game. It was our first year there, and we had cords that wasn't wireless. And I came home. We lived out in Northridge, and I came home, and everybody's in bed except my wife. And my son held my cords. And he was in high school at the time. And I thought everybody'd be up, really pumped up and excited. And Terry told me that Matt had gone to bed, that he was really disappointed in the language I had used. And you couldn't have taken a knife and stabbed me and made me feel worse. So, and that really is true. And so from 1995 on, that became important to me, that I would want now my grandkids to watch me coach, and that I wouldn't have to apologize for anything. Mm-hmm. And that didn't say that I never cussed. But from 1995 on, if I did cuss, players would know I was really pissed.
Right.
And so that became, I even said in one of my year-end meetings with Coach Garrett, which I think took him back a little bit. I said, Coach, my grandkids, I'd love to have them watch our team practice and how they approach the game and preparation. I said, I really wouldn't want my grandkids to listen to our coach's coach. Mm. And I said, here's a young coach who's now at a Power 5 school, and he's running the scout team. And I stepped in, and because I tried to coach the guys on the scout team, because there you've got to service each other in pro football. And he's describing this play, and he dropped 7 F-bombs in the time that he was doing that. And I said, what are we teaching these guys? Right. Do the players think that we're tougher because we drop an F-bomb? No, they don't, and so there are some, and you watch the show, there are some that, that, and more than you'd care to say, that I wouldn't want my grandkids, right, hearing me talk that way, so I think faith for coaches and players, and in a very, it can be a little bit conflicting because it is such a tough,
violent sport.
Yeah. Just a funny story. Earl Bruce, when we were in the staff room now, he he could cuss with the best of them. But if ever there was a lady around, you wouldn't hear him say damn. I mean, he was, and people thought, or there were some that thought it was sexist because he didn't want any female trainers. I don't think it had anything to do with female trainers. It was that he didn't want to have to watch,
Right.
How he talks. So it's a violent, intense sport, and so there are conflicting in some ways.
Right. So, Steve, the way we end every episode of the Moonlight Graham Show is with the 5 big questions. All right? So buckle up.
All right.
First question is, who's your all-time favorite guy to coach with?
Tom Lichtenberg.
Oh.
He was my best friend. I coached with him at Iowa State. I coached with him at Colorado State for a very, very short period of time. And I coached with him at Drake. And he any problem child that there was on the team, Coach Bruce would sick Tom on him because he had tremendous relationship with players, good knowledge of the game, and also he was one that he helped me with my faith, but also you could go to a staff party, Christmas party, whatever, and you'd see some guys having several adult beverages, and Tom never did.
Really?
But he had more fun than anybody.
Yeah.
So I looked and I said, here's a guy that has a great relationship with people. He was my best friend, but there's probably 10 people that say that Tom Lichtenberg was their best friend. So I would say Tom from that standpoint.
So you spent a lot of time as an offensive coordinator. I'm a big fan of trick plays. What was your favorite trick play to draw up? Well,
it really probably wouldn't qualify as a trick play, but the reverse against the University of Iowa on the opening play of the game that in 2000.
Was that J.J. Moses?
J.J. Moses.
Oh, yeah, I can still see him running down the sidelines.
Oh, I mean, he broke that kid's ankles there at the end, but that, without a doubt, is because we'd watch Aaron Campman was suckered in. He was trying to make every play, and so it was funny. I almost lost my nerve, and my wife and I were laying in bed that Thursday night, and she said, "What are you going to open up with?" And I said, "Well, I've been convinced all week that the reverse is what we need to do." And I said, "But I'm really worried about it. If it's a negative play, that's going to give Iowa, is at Iowa, it's going to get them all pumped up and thinking they can win and all that stuff." And I said, and she looked at me and she said, "If you're convinced it was going to work on Monday, it'll work on Saturday." And so that happened. And, and then we had the double pass, the other end of the continuum against Nebraska in that same year. We threw to Lane Danielson, who was going to throw it down the field, and we were right with Nebraska. I think we were down by 3 at the time. And we called timeout, and I told Lane, I said, "Listen, we'll toss it out there to you. If it's not there, just get back to the line of scrimmage and we'll be fine."
Right.
Well, it gets intercepted, and I can't remember if it went for a score, if it was a pick six or inside the 5, and we went down by 10, and then, it kind of was the turning point of the game. So trick plays were always you could find them both ways. But Glenn Mason, who I worked for at the University of Minnesota, and great head coach there, he was a great head coach when it came to trick plays, because he'd say, if you think they work, just call them. If they don't work, they don't work. You know, and
don't make it a bigger thing. Like,
don't
it's
make
just another play.
It's just another play. And if ever we had to practice a trick play several times during the week, he said,
Too complicated.
Too complicated,
Toss
throw it out.
Yep.
You know, and so Glenn really taught me about trick plays, and so you call them and let it fly.
Yeah. What's one game that you look back on that's like maybe your favorite victory?
Oh boy. Well, listen, I coached 44 years, so you're asking me to do something that really that game against Iowa
At Kinnick
was big. We beat the Packers on Monday Night Football in Lambeau.
Which team is that with?
The Vikings.
With the Vikes.
And then we opened up, you know, when they went to renovation at Green Bay.
Mm-hmm.
We opened the season up in Green Bay, and we beat them there. You know, and you know, so the wins over Iowa and Green Bay were always my favorite ones. When I retired, I said, as a player and as a coach, I've got a winning record against Iowa, so I can retire now. But those were always good.
Mm-hmm.
And Matt Burke told me when I retired, he said, of course, he's got a Super Bowl ring that he
with
got
the Ravens,
with the Ravens. But he said the favorite win was when we were playing the Packers in the playoffs. And we got the ball back with 6 minutes to go in the lead. And he said they never got the ball back.
That's cool.
Yep.
So what's the flip side of that? What's the loss that still keeps you up at night, Steve?
The loss in overtime to Wyoming was bad. And
was that the season opener?
It was a season opener. It went to overtime, and I was way too complicated in what I told the captains going out there, and that's when overtime, the first year of overtime.
I was at that game.
Yeah.
I was there.
And we won it, and we went on offense. And it was 100% my fault, because
you got to go on D to figure out what you need.
Right. And rather than just tell them, very simply, we win, go on defense. I go into this big, long dissertation, well, if they go on defense, we can choose the end of the field,
right,
all that stuff. And so that one I feel absolutely horrendous about. It was not Dan McCarney's fault. I accept that, and that and you always have, I wish I would have called this, or wish I would have done that. But in games, that one sticks out the most because I screwed it. It was me.
Sure. So we're a podcast about the underdogs.
Yep.
And you mentioned it, you were a walk-on. I walked on in college as well. I always liked those underdogs, those walk-on stories, those undrafted free agents into the NFL. Yep. Who's the one guy when you think of athletes in that vein, whether it's a walk-on or an undrafted guy? You mentioned Rico Gathers earlier. What's the one guy that kind of really sticks out in that underdog?
Danny Amendola.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah.
Did you have him with the Rams?
With the Rams. And loved him. but he was a guy that, I don't know if he walked on in college, but he wasn't highly recruited. And then, of course, we got him off, I think it was Kansas City's practice squad. Now, that may be wrong, but it was off somebody's practice squad. And he came and, oh, man, Cole Beasley's another one. Those two guys probably, but Danny, number one.
Yeah, he's still in the league, still.
Yeah, Detroit.
Done really well, yeah. And he won a ring, I think, with New England, too, with Brady there, too. Yeah, he's had a really nice career.
Yeah.
So, Steve, final question here. What is the best advice you've ever received?
One that, again, there's a lot over 44 years, but never too high and never too low. You have to live that way. Because in coaching, and in playing, when you lose a game, that game stays with you for 6 days until you play again. When you win, you enjoy it for, 12 hours?
Right. Because
you're on to the next opponent. And it never failed. Every Monday I'd say, oh, my gosh, how are we going to get a first down, and so that to me is kind of sad about coaching. But you have to stay level. And because if you don't, then you're on a roller coaster and your players then are on roller coaster. Because right. I do think that your players reflect you. And if you're a roller coaster guy, they're going to be roller coaster players. Mm-hmm. And it's not that losing doesn't hurt. I've done more than my fair share of it. But you can't let losing define you. You have to be defined about all these other things we talked about. And winning, if you say winning defines you, well, it defines you until you lose. And then, people, it is a fickle business. Mm-hmm. Probably one of the tougher things when I retired was that I think the game was more important to me than I was to the game. Mm. And, but when you're in it, you're thinking, oh man, I'm really making this big contribution and, all this stuff, you have to stay humble because the game can humble you quickly. Right. But really, that never too high, never too low advice is so important, because otherwise you let things define you that really have.
Yeah, the way you described winning and losing there, I thought was perfect. Yeah. In that when you lose, it sticks with you, for at least a week, but sometimes forever.
Well, yeah, I'm talking about the Wyoming game.
Yeah, I know. And those wins, though, everything is so fleeting, because it's always like, okay, on to the next one, one. And losing always hurts way more than winning is fun, or the joy of winning. You know what I mean? And that's just the way it is. But we're tortured by it. But we've also chosen to be sports fanatics, and we've also chosen our own profession. So that totally resonates with me, because I can remember so many more losses and home runs given up than I can outs or strikeouts that I've had.
Yeah, it's we had a Christmas Eve loss to the Packers in the Metrodome. And we got beat by a field goal. You talk about the pull some guys have. Well, Brett Favre, it's third, and they had no timeouts left. And I'm not exactly certain, but let's say it's 3rd and 14. He completes a pass, so they do not have enough time to get the field goal team on the field. okay? Only, and if it gets to fourth down, he can't clock it. Mm-hmm. So if it was 3rd and 14, he completes it for 13 and a half yards. I mean, I'm standing on the sideline looking down. It wasn't even close to a first down. He starts screaming to the official, you got to measure it, you got to measure it, you got to measure it. They stop to measure it. During that time, the field goal team gets out.
Wow.
So, but
that's just a savvy old veteran move right there by Favre is what that is.
Yeah, no question. And but it's Christmas Eve, and Kylan, our youngest, was up in Minneapolis and going to have Christmas with us, and so that was a gut-wrenching loss. Right. And so, we're leaving
coal in your stocking.
Yeah, and we're leaving the stadium, and Terry says, "You know what? Put your Christmas face on, and you got to. I mean, there's a lot more in the big scope of things."
Yeah. But, it still hurts.
Oh.
But, you got to be dad and you got to be grandpa and you got to be Santa Claus the next day.
Yeah.
But really in your mind, you're thinking, that Brett Favre did it again.
Oh, no question.
Yeah. Well, Steve, this has been a lot of fun. Thank you so much for having me in the garage today and having on the podcast. So this has been so much fun. Thank you for taking the time.
Well, it's an honor, and I certainly appreciate you spending the time with me.
Hey guys, thanks once again to listening to today's episode of the Moonlight Graham Show. And even though I do most of the interviews here on the podcast, there is a ton of work that happens behind the scenes that you guys don't see that make each episode possible. So I got to give a shout out to the Moonlight Graham Show team. First of all, Brian Sandvig, our producer. Brian does all of the post-production work, and in real life, he's not just a podcast producer, he's also a real estate agent. So if you're looking to buy or sell a home down in the Kansas or Missouri areas, give Brian Sandvig a call. Next guy on that list is Brendan Gargano. Brendan does all of our design and artwork here on the podcast. He's one of the most talented artists I've ever met, and I love all of his work. If you need any help on the design side with logos or anything like that, give Brendan Gargano a call. The next guy on that list is Andy Flattery, my older brother. Andy, of course, has done some of the interviews here on the podcast. He also is a certified financial planner. He owns a business called Simple Wealth Planning. If you need any help in that area, check Andy Flattery out. And then, of course, the trusty co-host Tom Griffin and my younger brother Neil Flattery. Those guys are just busy being husbands, being fathers, they're family men, but also they do a ton of work here on the show. So thanks again for listening. We really appreciate you guys subscribing and supporting the Moonlight Graham Show.